So lesson three, again, a common theme throughout the process, it's all about time. So as generally expected, time was required for the tagging process, particularly the initial mapping. And obviously the whole point of this was to build that process in advance. But what we also found was that there was an additional time needed for the subsequent reviews at the final stage of the process. Now, I know you've got experience on this, but what was your particular experience on the review process? And do you want to provide a little bit more detail on these subsequent reviews?
As you said, I think issuers were generally well prepared for the introduction of XBRL in a way that they knew that it's coming, and then they knew they needed to spend some time on it. However, I think they didn't realize that XBRL is such an iterative process. With every change of the financials, you have a new version of XBRL, then you have the auditors reviewing that version, obviously the client reviewing it as well. So while it is true that the initial mapping that can be done well before the year end, it takes away probably 80–90% of your work because your financials don't change that much. So if you do the initial mapping, say in September, October, you will get much done. But then there are changes. The financials, though, they don't stay the same from year to year. Even the phase financials, they stay the same. So there will be new versions, there will be changes not only to numbers, but also to lines. You might have a new transaction, something specific that you didn't have before. Suddenly you have to add a line, and then you have to review it, the auditors have to review it. It just takes time.
And obviously, lesson 4 leads on from lesson 3. We've already said that the general rule was to build time outside of the main workflow, and that's obviously close to your production of your annual report. But the emphasis is what can be done up front, mapping and tagging and the pilot validation studies. So there'll be no surprises at the final stage of the process. So you can see the timeline that we built together here was basically to do that first step up front. And then in the second stage, basically go through and, we call it periodic update, but rolling forward your numbers, converting the document into XHTML, putting that process together and going through the validation procedure, which is key. So final thoughts on that? And again, the key part is do as much as you can up front, correct?
Absolutely. Use the time that you have when you are less busy, which is usually before the end years. Yeah. And use that time for the initial mapping using your prior year or maybe half year financials, depending which are closer to your planned financials for the next year. And that way you can take, as I said, maybe 80–90% of your work when you are so busy in January, February, and March.
And what I would also say as well is just make sure that you build that time into the workflow with all the parties involved. So auditors, design agencies, outside vendors, anybody else that is you're bringing into that process as well. Make sure that that workflow and that time is basically added into that process up front as well.